All right, so today we're going to dive deep into Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy.
Okay.
And we're going to kind of look at all the ways ego can really kind of mess us up, on our way to trying to find success and fulfillment and all those things that, that we're after in life.
Yeah.
And it's not always just being arrogant, it can be much more subtle than that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that this book, I think, really does well,
Yeah.
is it highlights how ego can kind of rear its head in all stages of our journey,
Yeah. Okay.
whether we're just starting out or if we've achieved a certain level of success,
Right.
or even when we're dealing with failure, it's always there lurking.
Yeah. So first off, how does Holiday actually define ego?
He defines it as this tendency towards self-absorption and delusion.
Okay.
And it can manifest in a lot of really sneaky ways. It's like that voice in your head that's always telling you, you got this all figured out, even when you don't.
Right.
It's that need to be right all the time, even when you should be taking feedback.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And it really feels kind of relevant, especially these days with social media and this constant pressure to achieve. It's easy to get caught up in appearances and lose sight of what really matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He kicks off the book by talking about this aspiring stage. So like when you're just starting out, and you're full of dreams and ambition.
Right.
And one of the first things that he kind of dives into is this idea that we can talk too much.
Oh, really? So you're saying like passion and enthusiasm isn't always a good thing?
Well, you would think that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, passion, enthusiasm, it's like those are the fuel
Yeah.
to getting things started. But Holiday makes this case that all that talking can actually be a form of procrastination.
Okay.
So think about it. When you're constantly kind of broadcasting your goals and you're seeking validation from everyone, you're almost trying to convince yourself as much as everyone else. And all that energy is being diverted from actually doing the work.
Right. Yeah.
He uses this example of a writer who spent like an entire year building her social media platform
Okay.
instead of writing her novel.
Yeah. All talk, no action.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that with someone like General Sherman,
Okay.
a key figure in the Civil War,
Mm.
incredibly ambitious guy. But he rarely talked about his plans or sought any kind of recognition.
Well,
He just focused on doing the work and letting the results speak for themselves.
it's funny because you mentioned this pressure to achieve, right? And I'm thinking about Bo Jackson.
What?
Bo knows.
Oh, knows, yeah.
Amazing athlete, excelled in both baseball and football.
Yeah.
He had these two huge goals that he wanted to achieve, winning the Heisman Trophy and then being the first pick in the NFL draft.
Huge goals.
Huge goals.
Yeah.
And you know who he told about those goals? Practically no one. Just his girlfriend. He was all about action. So I guess the takeaway there is sometimes the best way to achieve your goals is to just focus on the work and let the actions speak louder than the words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant takeaway. And that segues perfectly into this next point that Holiday makes about being a student.
Okay.
Even, or maybe especially, when you're just starting out.
Okay. So he uses the example of Kirk Hammett.
Yes. Kirk Hammett, the guitarist for Metallica.
Right.
And, he does something that you wouldn't really expect someone who just joined, one of the biggest bands in the world to do.
What's that?
He finds a guitar teacher.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, this guy is living the dream, right?
Yeah.
He's playing sold-out stadiums. He's got everything you could imagine a rock star wants. And he still recognizes that he has so much to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though he's already playing at an incredibly high level.
It's a great reminder that no matter where you are in your journey, you can still grow and improve.
Absolutely. And Holiday really highlights how dangerous it can be to get complacent.
Yeah.
To think, oh, I'm good enough. I don't need to keep learning, because that's when you really start to miss out on the opportunity to become truly great.
Okay.
And, he contrasts this with a plus-minus equal formula that Frank Shamrock uses to train his fighters, who's, this mixed martial arts champion.
Right.
And Shamrock emphasizes that to really improve, you need to be constantly learning from those who are better than you.
Okay.
That's the plus. You need to be teaching those who are less experienced. That's the minus.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be challenging those who are at your level. That's the equal.
Wow.
So it's a constant cycle of growth.
It's fascinating. So even when you're at the top of your game, you still need to have that mindset of, pushing yourself and finding mentors and just honing those skills.
Absolutely.
So this is where it gets interesting. Holiday argues against passion.
He does. It's like this really counterintuitive argument, right?
Yeah.
Don't be passionate. But he's not saying passion is bad.
Okay.
What he's really doing is making a distinction between blind passion and a more kind of deliberate, measured approach.
Okay, so like what's the difference there?
So blind passion, he argues, can actually be dangerous because it leads to unrealistic expectations,
Right.
poor planning, and ultimately failure. And he uses some examples that are kind of hard to argue with.
Right. Well, he brings up the segue.
The segue, yes.
Right. And that guy was so passionate about this idea that, he really went all in. But it's like he didn't stop to think, was there even a market for this thing?
Right. And then he also brings up the Iraq War,
Okay.
which was obviously driven by a lot of passion, a lot of conviction,
Right.
but there wasn't a lot of kind of realistic assessment of what the potential consequences might be.
Okay. And then there's Into the Wild.
Yeah.
The guy that went into the Alaskan wilderness, totally unprepared.
Totally unprepared.
And, ultimately perished because of it. So I guess it's like passion is not bad. It's just it needs to be, balanced with
Realism.
realism and a clear plan.
Absolutely.
Right. So you don't just become this runaway train that, that leads to disaster.
Exactly. And what Holiday advocates for is combining that passion with a more strategic approach.
Okay.
He calls it the canvas strategy.
The canvas strategy. All right. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So the canvas strategy is all about focusing on making your superiors or your mentors look good.
Okay.
Rather than trying to grab the spotlight for yourself
Okay.
or claim all the credit. It's about working behind the scenes, quietly contributing, learning from those who are more experienced than you.
So you're saying instead of like promoting myself, in those early stages, I should be making other people look good.
It seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But Holiday argues that the canvas strategy actually puts you in a much stronger position over the long term. He uses the example of Benjamin Franklin, who would submit articles anonymously
Really?
to his brother's newspaper.
Wow.
No credit, just the opportunity to hone his writing skills and learn about public opinion and build a reputation, And think about this. Think about Bill Belichick, the head coach of the Patriots, one of the most successful coaches in NFL history. Early in his career, he was known for mastering film analysis,
Right.
which back then was considered grunt work. Nobody wanted to do it.
Yeah.
He did it without complaining, without demanding recognition.
He just put his head down and did the work.
Exactly, which allowed him to gain experience and build relationships that would later really benefit him. It's like he was quietly weaving himself into the fabric of the game,
Yeah.
and influencing its direction.
So the canvas strategy is about playing the long game.
Yeah, putting in the work, building your skills, and then letting your actions kind of pave the way for future success.
Yeah.
But it does require humility and restraint, which I think, especially when you're starting out and eager to make your mark, can be challenging.
Yeah. And speaking of restraint, Holiday tells this incredibly powerful story about Jackie Robinson,
Yeah.
becoming the first Black player in Major League Baseball.
Jackie Robinson's story is truly remarkable. I mean, just the amount of racism and aggression that he faced,
Right.
both on and off the field. And he still managed to maintain his composure and keep his eye on the bigger goal,
Amazing.
which was to integrate the sport. And, he had this agreement with Branch Rickey, the Dodgers manager, that he wouldn't retaliate no matter what was thrown at him.
I mean, just the amount of self-control that must have taken. I mean, imagine being constantly provoked
yeah.
and targeted with racial slurs and threats, right? And knowing that if you react in anger, it's not only going to jeopardize your career, but also like set back, this entire movement.
It's hard to even fathom that level of self-control, Yeah. And it's interesting to contrast his behavior with, let's say, someone like Ted Williams,
No.
one of the greatest hitters of all time.
Right. Right.
But, he had this reputation for being
Difficult?
a little difficult. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, he was once caught spitting at fans who were booing him,
Wow.
And you imagine if Jackie Robinson had done something like that,
It would have been disastrous.
it would have been a disaster. Exactly. And that's Holiday's point. Sometimes to achieve something truly great, you have to endure a certain level of unfairness
Okay.
and restrain yourself even when it feels impossible. And our ego, a lot of times, it makes us react in ways that are just totally self-defeating.
Right.
But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is just step back,
Right.
take a breath, and choose that harder path of restraint.
Okay, so how do we deal with those inevitable challenges and pushback we're going to get when we're striving for something, big and meaningful? Holiday says a key strategy is to get out of our own heads.
Right. He's talking about the narratives that we create about ourselves.
Okay.
Like these stories that can actually blind us to reality and prevent us from seeing things clearly. It can be a form of self-sabotage.
Right.
I'm thinking of characters like Holden Caulfield
Right.
from Catcher in the Rye, so consumed by his own angst
Yeah.
that he can't connect with the world around him.
Hmm.
And then Arturo Bandini from Ask the Dust.
Okay.
This guy who's so obsessed with his own genius that he misses out on actually living life,
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's not just fictional characters either. Holiday points to real-life figures like General McClellan,
Okay.
who was a brilliant military strategist, but he was ultimately crippled by self-doubt and overthinking. He became his own worst enemy.
Right. So it's like we create these illusions about ourselves,
Oh,
these
yeah.
stories to try and make sense of the world.
Yeah.
But sometimes those stories get so distorted that they actually prevent us from achieving our goals.
Exactly.
So how do we break free from these self-limiting narratives?
Well, I think it starts with developing self-awareness, challenging those stories,
Okay.
asking yourself, is this story I'm telling myself actually true?
Yeah.
Or is it just my ego trying to protect me from discomfort?
Okay. Holiday also talks about the dangers of early pride.
Yes.
He says when we achieve success too quickly, it can be really easy to let it go to our heads.
He tells this great story about John D. Rockefeller,
Okay.
who, despite being incredibly successful at a young age, was constantly reminding himself to stay grounded.
Okay.
He would have these nightly conversations with himself and say things like, because you got to start, you think you're quite a merchant, look out or you'll lose your head, go steady.
Wow. So it's like he was actively fighting against his own ego,
Yeah.
recognizing that pride could lead to complacency and ruin. And he understood that, even though he was on the right track, he couldn't let early success, blind him to the need to continue to work hard and be vigilant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that leads perfectly into this next theme that Holiday explores,
Yeah.
which is hard work.
Okay.
He emphasizes that talent and good ideas just simply aren't enough.
Right.
Real success requires consistent effort and dedication and a willingness to put in the hours.
Right. And he uses the example of Edgar Degas.
Oh, yes, the painter.
Right. And Degas actually tried to write poetry for a while,
You did.
but he struggled with it. And he was complaining to his friend, the poet Stéphane Mallarmé, that, I'm full of ideas, I just can't get them onto the page. And Mallarmé's response is brilliant. He's like, it's not with ideas, my dear Degas. That one makes verse. It's with words.
It's with work.
Yeah, right. It's about taking those ideas, shaping them, refining them,
Right.
and just putting in the effort to bring them to life.
Exactly.
And he also quotes Henry Ford, who said, you can't build a reputation on what you're going to do.
It's all about the doing.
Right.
Right.
It's not about the dreaming, it's about the doing. And he talks about alive time versus dead time, right? So he's saying every moment, every situation, it's almost like a choice we have to be passive
Yeah.
and let time slip away or be active, engaged, and learning.
Absolutely. And he uses the example of Malcolm X,
Right.
who was able to kind of transform himself during his time in prison.
Yeah. Yeah.
He could have easily just given up and let those years be dead time.
Right.
But instead, he used them to educate himself,
Yeah.
to read voraciously, and become the powerful leader he was meant to be.
And that's an incredible example of how even in the most difficult of circumstances, you can choose to make your time alive and use it for growth or transformation.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here in this first part, exploring Holiday's insights into the dangers of ego, when we're just starting out and aspiring for those big goals.
And we've only scratched the surface.
Right. Ego doesn't just disappear when we achieve success.
It can get even trickier.
Right. So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy. We'll be exploring the traps that ego sets for us in times of success
Yeah.
and how to navigate those challenges with grace, humility, and that relentless focus on the work that really matters.
It's going to be good.
All right, thanks for listening. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about how ego can trip us up when we're just starting out, trying to reach those big goals.
Yeah.
But what happens when we actually, get there? What happens when we achieve success? Does ego just disappear?
I wish it were that easy.
Right.
Unfortunately, no. In fact, in a lot of ways, success can actually make ego even trickier.
Okay.
It's like
Yeah.
the more we achieve, the more we're feeding that inner saboteur.
Yeah, that makes sense. Success can breed this like sense of entitlement
Right.
and make us think that we're exempt from all the rules,
Absolutely.
the rules that everyone else has to follow.
He uses the example of Howard Hughes,
Okay.
the aviator,
Yeah.
filmmaker,
Right.
billionaire, who kind of ultimately succumbed to his own ego.
Right.
He became so isolated and paranoid and started making these impulsive decisions
Okay.
that really cost him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic cautionary tale.
It is.
Hughes, he had it all: talent, wealth, fame,
Yeah.
but ego just drove him to ruin.
Yeah, it can be really destructive if we're not careful.
Right. So how do we avoid that?
Right. How do we prevent success from, like, inflating our ego
Right.
to dangerous levels? Well, one of the things that Holiday talks about is resisting the temptation to craft these self-serving narratives.
Okay.
It's so easy to look back on our successes and tell ourselves this story like it was all part of the plan, or, I was destined for greatness all along.
Yeah.
But that kind of thinking can really blind us to the role of luck and timing and all the contributions that other people made.
Right. Right.
Remember Bill Walsh? Coached the 49ers to their first Super Bowl?
Yeah.
Brilliant strategist.
Yeah.
But even he was reluctant to take all the credit for the team's turnaround.
Right.
He acknowledged that a lot of it was just, factors that were outside of his control.
It's so tempting to want to take all the credit when things are going well.
Oh, absolutely.
But success really is often a combination of, skill and hard work and a little bit of luck.
Yeah.
Right? So what else can we do to keep our ego in check, when we're riding high?
One of the things that Holiday emphasizes is the importance of staying a student even after you've achieved success.
Okay.
We talked about this, in the aspiring stage.
Right.
But it's even more crucial maybe when you're at the top of your game.
Right.
You
Right.
can't just rest on your laurels and assume you've got it all figured out.
Right.
There's always more to learn. There's always room for improvement.
Okay. So he uses a surprising example here. Genghis Khan,
Genghis Khan.
the conqueror. Right.
Yeah.
What does he have to do with being a student?
It's funny because it's not the image that we typically have of them,
Really?
right? But even though he was known for being ruthless on the battlefield, Genghis Khan was actually a lifelong learner.
Okay.
He was constantly trying to learn new things and adapt
Right.
because he understood that to maintain power and expand his empire, he needed to keep evolving.
Okay. Yeah.
He would study the tactics of his enemies.
Okay.
He would embrace new technologies.
Right.
He would even consult with, scholars and advisors from other cultures.
So it's like he was always trying to upgrade, his
Mhm.
his mental software, I guess you could say.
Right, right.
Recognizing that the world was changing and he needed to change with it.
And Holiday makes this really compelling argument that open-mindedness and that willingness to constantly learn was one of the key reasons why the Mongol Empire became so vast and so influential.
Right.
It wasn't just about, brute force. It was about strategy and a thirst for knowledge.
So even the most powerful people in the world can benefit from having that kind of student mindset.
Yeah.
Another thing that he talks about is this illusion of control
Yes.
that can come with success.
Yeah.
So what does he mean by that?
He's talking about this belief that we're the ones calling the shots,
Okay.
that we can predict and manipulate outcomes.
Right.
And as he points out, a lot of times that's just not true. It's a delusion.
Okay.
And he uses the example of Richard Nixon,
Okay.
whose paranoia and need for control
Yeah.
ultimately led to his downfall.
Right. Right.
It's a classic case of ego clouding our judgment
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
driving us to make really bad decisions.
Decisions that are not only unethical, but also self-destructive.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the antidotes to this, according to Holiday, is cultivating humility.
Okay.
Remembering that we're not as in control as we think we are.
Right. Yeah.
And instead of trying to micromanage every aspect of our lives,
Right.
we should focus on managing ourselves,
Okay.
developing systems and routines that allow us to stay grounded even when things get crazy.
It reminds me of the contrast between Dwight Eisenhower,
Okay.
who was known for being so meticulous
Right,
in
right,
his planning,
right.
versus John DeLorean, who was much more chaotic and ego-driven.
Yeah.
And it ultimately, led to the downfall of his company.
It's a great example
Right.
of how success doesn't automatically make you a good leader.
Right.
It takes a whole other set of skills
Okay.
and a willingness to keep improving.
So Holiday also stresses this idea of avoiding what he calls the disease of me.
The disease of me. Yeah.
Okay, what is that?
It's essentially this excessive self-focus,
Okay.
putting our needs and desires above everything else.
Okay.
That constant question of, what's in it for me?
Yeah.
And I think we've all been there,
Right.
especially when we achieve some level of success.
It's like that question of, are we serving our ego or serving something larger?
Absolutely.
Right.
And he uses this really powerful example of someone who consistently chose the latter. General George C. Marshall.
Okay.
This guy consistently put the needs of his country and the military above his own personal ambitions.
Wow.
He even declined the command of D-Day forces
Really?
because he felt he was more valuable in Washington.
That's an amazing example of selflessness.
Yeah.
Right. And commitment to something bigger than himself.
Right.
It takes a lot of humility to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
Right.
And to cultivate that sense of perspective, Holiday suggests reflecting on the vastness of the universe,
Right.
And our place in it.
Yeah.
He talks about the naturalist John Muir,
Okay.
whose experiences in the Alaskan wilderness gave him this profound sense of awe and humility.
So it's like we're just a small part of something much bigger.
Exactly.
Right. And our little ego-driven concerns aren't really that important in the grand scheme of things.
And that brings us to the failure stage.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because it's often in those moments of failure that our ego is the most vulnerable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, when things are going well, it's easier to be rational,
Right.
Keep your composure.
Right.
But when we experience setbacks, it's so easy to just lash out,
Oh, yeah.
blame other people or make impulsive decisions.
And Holiday uses the example of John DeLorean again.
Okay.
After his car company failed, he ended up getting involved in a drug deal.
Oh, wow.
Like a desperate attempt to try to save his business.
Wow.
And instead of, accepting responsibility and learning from his mistakes,
Right.
he doubled down on these ego-driven impulses
Oh, right.
and just make things worse.
And failure can be a teacher, but only if we're open to the lesson, right?
Exactly.
So how do we do that? How do we navigate failure in a way that doesn't just let our ego, completely run the show?
Holiday says one of the keys is to focus on what you can control.
Okay.
Your effort, your attitude, your response to the situation.
Okay.
He tells the story of Belisarius, this brilliant Roman general who won all these amazing victories,
Okay.
but then was ultimately betrayed and mistreated by the emperor.
Wow.
But even though he was dealt this really unfair hand, he never lost sight of his duty.
Yeah.
He continued to do his best. He acted with honor and integrity,
Okay.
even when it seemed like everything was against him.
So it's an example of how to maintain your principles,
Right.
even when things are really rough.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's not about denying the pain of failure. It's about recognizing that it's part of life.
Yeah.
And it can make you stronger.
It goes back to that alive time versus dead time, right?
Absolutely.
Choosing to use even the most challenging situations to learn and grow.
Like Malcolm X in prison.
Right. Yeah.
He could have just wallowed in self-pity,
Yeah.
but instead he used that time to transform himself.
Oh, okay.
And Holiday also emphasizes this idea of maintaining our own internal scorecard.
Okay, so instead of comparing ourselves to other people,
Yeah, or seeking validation from outside sources.
it's about defining your own metrics for success.
Yeah.
Based on your values, your journey.
So it's not about the external validation.
It's about recognizing that life is a series of tests and challenges.
Okay.
And your character is revealed in how you respond to them.
And how do we actually, develop that strength of character?
Well, Holiday suggests cultivating a mindset of love and forgiveness,
Okay.
even toward those who have wronged us.
Okay.
He uses the example of Orson Welles,
Okay.
who, later in his career became really bitter,
Yeah.
and contrast that with Frederick Douglass
Right.
and Martin Luther King Jr.,
Yeah.
who, advocated for love and understanding even towards their enemies.
Yeah. So it's a reminder that hate and resentment can be really self-destructive.
Absolutely.
Right. And that love can be the source of strength,
Yeah.
especially when we're dealing with failure.
It's about recognizing that we all make mistakes.
Right.
And that holding on to anger is just going to hold us back. So even when we're feeling defeated, we still have this choice, right?
Yes.
We can either let our ego drag us down
Yeah.
or choose to rise above it.
It's a powerful message.
So how do we put all this into practice? How do we actually tame this beast called ego?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Right.
But Holiday offers some really valuable insights and strategies
Right.
that can help us.
So taming our ego is not like a one-time fix.
Right, it's this ongoing process, this
Right.
constant battle.
And that's why it's so important to understand what ego is,
Yeah.
how it shows up in our lives,
Absolutely.
how we can keep it in check.
And that's what we'll dive into in the final part of our deep dive into. Ego is the enemy.
Okay, so we've talked about how ego can sabotage us when we're starting out, how it can get even worse when we achieve success, and how it can totally derail us when we're dealing with failure. So now, how do we actually tame this thing?
Right. How do we win this battle against ego? Well, like we've been saying, it really is a lifelong battle. You
Yeah.
know, there's no quick fix. But Holiday uses this great analogy. He compares managing ego to, like, sweeping the floor.
Okay.
So you sweep it once, and it's clean, but the dust keeps coming back. Right?
Yeah, it's a brilliant analogy because it's like ego is something that can just accumulate if we're not paying attention.
Exactly.
We get complacent, start believing our own hype,
Right.
and before we know it, we're just surrounded by like a mountain of dust bunnies.
He tells this story about Dov Sharney, the founder of American Apparel.
Okay.
And after he got ousted from his company, he just seemed to completely unravel.
Right.
Lashing out, making these impulsive decisions, clinging to this story that he was the victim.
Okay.
It was like his ego, which had probably helped him get to a certain level of success, totally backfired on him when he was faced with failure.
Yeah, he couldn't let go of that image he had of himself.
Right.
And ultimately, it cost him everything.
It's like ego promises us security and validation and control, but ultimately it's a really fragile foundation.
Right. And when it crumbles, which at some point it does for all of us,
Yeah.
it can be devastating.
So how do we avoid that?
If ego is the enemy, how do we win?
It's a great question.
What are our weapons?
Well, Holiday doesn't give us this simple prescription, but he points to some really important things. Self-awareness,
Okay.
humility,
Yeah.
a focus on the work, and a willingness to keep learning.
Right. Right.
It's about understanding that ego is always there, waiting for a chance to take over.
Okay.
So we have to constantly challenge our own assumptions, seek feedback, and remember there's always more to learn.
It's like we need to develop this internal ego detector.
Yes, I love that.
Right, that can spot those red flags like a sense of entitlement or the need to always be right.
Right, or blaming others when things go wrong.
Right, exactly. He also talks about finding something bigger than yourself to serve,
Yes.
whether it's a cause or a community or even just pursuing excellence in your field.
When we shift our focus from what's in it for me to how can I make a positive impact,
Okay.
it can be incredibly freeing
Right.
because it allows us to approach our work with a sense of purpose and meaning that goes beyond just feeding the ego.
That's a great point. So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into ego is the enemy, what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
Let me see.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to this idea that life is a journey, not a destination.
Okay.
And ego is that voice that tries to tell us that we've arrived, that we're special, that we're above the rules. But honestly, we're all works in progress.
Right.
And the more we can embrace that, the more we can let go of that need to be right, to be perfect, to
yeah.
be in control. And I think that's when we really open ourselves up to the joy of learning and growing.
I love that. It's a good reminder that the journey itself is the reward.
Yeah.
And by taming our ego, we unlock our potential and experience that fulfillment that goes way beyond just external validation. So to everyone listening, keep sweeping that floor, keep challenging your ego, keep learning, and keep striving.
The journey is worth it.
I agree. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Ego is the Enemy. If this resonated with you, I highly recommend checking out Ryan Holiday's book.
It's a good one.
It's full of so many great insights that can really change the way you approach your work and your relationships and your life.
Absolutely.
Until next time.